The first people I told about seeing the Blessed Mother were two homicide detectives, and I believe they thought I was confessing to a murder. Not the one they were investigating, a local tragedy of shattered steel and broken lives, but one far older, more insidious, a murder of truth perhaps, or sanity. Their presence in my rectory study at 3:14 a.m. was a stark, unwelcome intrusion into a world that, just moments before, had been utterly impossibly transformed. The antique grandfather clock in the hall chimed 1/4 the hour, its brassy declaration a crude counterpoint to the profound, lingering silence that settled between us. My hands were still trembling. Not from fear, no. I am a priest. I have faced deathbeds and confessionals, confronted the rawest grief and the darkest sin. Fear is a familiar companion. But this was something else entirely. This was a tremor born of an awe so profound, so utterly consuming. It pressed down on me like a physical weight, like the very hand of God had brushed against my soul and left behind a reverberation too immense for my mortal frame to contain. My fingers twitched, a desperate, futile urge to make the sign of the cross, to find some ancient ritual to ground me, but even that felt inadequate, a mere whisper against the roar of the impossible truth. Detective Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of the city's grim realities, sat opposite me, his pen scratching methodically on a small notepad. He was ostensibly here about the suicide, a young man racked by guilt over a fatal car accident found an hour ago in his own garage. Miller's questions had been procedural, his gaze distant, as if my responses were just another entry in an endless ledger of human misery. His partner, a younger, sharper-eyed man named Rodriguez, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his attention less on the details of the official inquiry and more on me. He hadn't spoken much, but his eyes were like probes, dissecting the strangeness of the scene. And what a scene it was! My study, usually a bastion of quiet contemplation and well-worn leather, felt alien, suffused with a scent that had no business being there. Fresh-cut roses. Not the heavy, cloying fragrance of a funeral wreath, but the delicate, vibrant perfume of blossoms newly opened, dewy with morning mist. It was ethereal, persistent, a fragrance of impossible beauty that clung to the air, subtly overriding the faint aroma of stale coffee and old books. It was a scandal, really, this scent. It was proof, and it was madness. Miller had been mid-sentence asking about the driver's state of mind when I cut him off. I couldn't bear another second of discussing the mundane mechanics of human despair when my own soul was still reeling from divine intervention. I leaned forward, my cassock feeling suddenly heavy, an ancient garment clinging to a man who had just stumbled out of a miracle. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice a ragged whisper that defied my priestly training. "There's something you need to know. Something that happened an hour ago. Just after 3 o'clock? Miller paused, pen still poised, an eyebrow raised in mild annoyance. "Father, we understand this is a shock, but we're trying to understand why Mr. Henderson chose to—" "It's about Lily Garcia," I interrupted, the name a sacred pronouncement. "The little girl from the accident. The one the doctor said was brain dead. The one they were about to unhook from the machines." The detective's pen lowered slowly, no longer poised. It rested flat against the pad. Miller glanced at Rodriguez, a flicker of professional caution passing between them. This wasn't part of their script. This was off-topic, emotional, perhaps even a little unhinged. "Father," Miller said, his tone firmer now, "we're terribly sorry about the child. It's a tragedy, truly, but that's not—" "She's asking for a glass of water," I blurted out, the words tumbling over each other, desperate to bridge the chasm between their reality and mine. "Right now, in the hospital. She spoke to her mother. She's awake. She's back." The effect was instantaneous and profound. Miller's face, which had been a mask of professional fatigue, tightened. Rodriguez shifted, pushing off the doorframe, his posture subtly changing from relaxed observation to wary assessment. The air in the room, already thick with the scent of roses, now crackled with a new, dangerous tension. "Father?" Miller repeated, his voice devoid of sympathy now, replaced by a careful neutrality. "Are you saying the child has made a recovery?" "Recovery doesn't begin to describe it," I said, my voice gaining strength, conviction overriding the lingering shock. "An hour ago, her parents were signing papers. An hour ago, there was no brain activity. Now she's asking for water. She's asking for her dolly." I paused, collecting myself, the sheer audacity of my next words momentarily stifling me. It was a miracle. Our Lady was here, in my room. She saved her. The silence that followed was not merely heavy, it was suffocating. It pressed down on me, colder than any fear, isolating me in a way I had never known. Miller's pen lay forgotten. His eyes, fixed on mine, held not disbelief, but something far more unsettling. Suspicion. He wasn't just questioning my sanity. He was questioning my story, looking for the gaps, the inconsistencies, the human explanation. His partner Rodriguez stood perfectly still, his gaze like a vice, dissecting my every tremor, every breath. In that terrible rose-scented quiet, I knew. I knew they saw a priest, yes, but they also saw a man who had just uttered an unfathomable claim. A man who perhaps had something else to hide. The kind of quiet that makes a man's cassock feel less like a sacred garment and more like a costume, easily removed, easily exposed. They were here for a suicide. I had just given them something else entirely, and the memory of roses, the impossible fragrance, was the only thing anchoring me to the truth, while their eyes, cold and assessing, sought to drag me back into a world where such things simply did not happen. A world where miracles demanded a very different kind of explanation. This was just the beginning. I knew, with chilling certainty, that this story was only just starting to unfold. The detectives, I believe, sought to dismantle my reality brick by brick. Their questions were surgical, designed to find the cracks in a story that, to their seasoned ears, could only be delusion or, God forbid, fabrication. The silence in my rectory, after I had spoken those unbelievable words, stretched taut and thin, threatening to snap. It was a silence that held the weight of their disbelief, a chasm between the world of verifiable facts and the boundless realm of the divine. They were waiting for me to falter, to confess to something tangible, something that fit within the neat gridded lines of their reports. But the truth, the radiant rose-scented truth, defied their logic, their experience, their very understanding of existence. They saw a man in a cassock, yes, but their gaze stripped it away, exposing what they presumed was merely a bewildered old man, perhaps losing his grip. They were here for a suicide, a tragic, mundane end to a life, and I had just given them a beginning, an impossible, glorious, terrifying start to a story that truly began not with their arrival, nor with my trembling confession, but some weeks earlier. The story, the profound, harrowing odyssey that brought the scent of roses into my rectory and a whisper of wonder into the stark reality of human suffering, did not commence in the pre-dawn quiet of my study. No, it unfurled its tragic first act 2 weeks prior, on a Tuesday evening that had begun like any other, only to be abruptly rent by the insistent, shrill clamor of the parish telephone. Its piercing ring, an unwelcome intrusion into the evening's settled peace, jolted me from my contemplative reading of the Compline prayers, stirring a premonition of disquiet deep within my bones. It was a sound that, for a priest, often heralds not joyful news, but urgent, often painful, cries for help, shattering the illusion of a world without sorrow. I remember glancing at the clock on my bedside table, its digital glow proclaiming it was just past 9. The hour was late enough to suggest emergency, too early for a casual chat. With a sigh that carried the unspoken weariness of 1,000 prior crises, I reached for the receiver. "Father Michael," I answered, my voice, I hoped, steady and reassuring, a familiar anchor in the choppy waters of someone else's distress. On the other end, the voice that greeted me was Elena Garcia's, and it was not merely fractured by panic. It was shattered, splintered into shards of raw, guttural sound. It was the sound of a mother's world collapsing, a primal shriek of despair barely contained by the thin wires of the telephone line. Her words tumbled out, disconnected, gasping for air, each syllable a fresh wound. "Father, Lily, Route 9, the hospital. It was a truck." My blood ran cold. Lily. 7-year-old Lily Garcia, a sprite of a girl with a laugh like wind chimes and eyes that held the innocent, boundless wonder of a nascent soul. Lily, who had made her first communion just last spring, her small hands clasped reverently, her spirit alight with joy. The memory of her radiant smile, framed by a veil of white lace, flickered behind my eyes, a stark, painful contrast to the terror now conveyed through Elena's fractured cries. Route 9, a treacherous stretch of highway notorious for its sharp bends and blind spots, was not a place for innocent souls to meet their fate. The following 14 days blurred into an agonizing tableau of sterile white walls, hushed voices, and the relentless mechanical symphony of the intensive care unit. As the parish priest of St. Jude's, a patron saint I often reflected, whose designation as the patron of lost causes felt painfully, prophetically fitting, my place was by their side. I walked the antiseptic corridors of the county hospital with a regularity that became a grim ritual, the familiar smell of disinfectant clinging to my cassock like a shroud. Each visit was a descent into a labyrinth of medical jargon and grim prognoses, a journey I made not as an observer, but as a reluctant guide, attempting to lead Elena and Javier through a darkness I could only dimly perceive. Elena, a woman whose life had been woven with threads of vibrant faith and unwavering devotion, transformed before my eyes. She became a permanent fixture in the small, plastic-seated waiting room outside Lily's room, her once lively eyes now sunken hollows, rimmed with perpetual exhaustion. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone underwater, each breath a conscious effort. Her rosary beads, smooth and worn from countless prayers, were never far from her trembling fingers. She would whisper prayers into the antiseptic air, a continuous, desperate plea, her voice a fragile counterpoint to the relentless beeping of the machines that had become her daughter's fragile heartbeat. Javier, a man of quiet strength, a carpenter whose hands were accustomed to shaping wood and building foundations, found his own strength being ground to dust, day by agonizing day. He sat beside Elena, his shoulders hunched, his gaze often fixed on some distant, unseen point beyond the hospital walls, as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. His face, usually open and kind, grew gaunt, etched with a grief so profound it seemed to pull the very light from his eyes. He tried to be the stoic rock for Elena, but I could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed composure, hairline fractures threatening to shatter his very being. His faith, once robust and unshakable, was slowly eroding under the relentless assault of cold, clinical prognoses. The doctors, competent and compassionate in their own way, spoke a language of grim certainty. They used terms like anoxic brain injury, minimal brain activity, GCS score of 3, and no viable path to recovery. Their words, delivered with a detached professionalism that, while necessary for their work, felt like blows to the fragile hope clinging to the Garcias' hearts, built an insurmountable wall around Lily's small, still form. They explained the intricate functions of the brain, the irreparable damage, the grim statistics, all while Lily lay tethered to a ventilator, her chest rising and falling in an artificial rhythm, a stark, agonizing imitation of life. Her small hand, when I took it, was warm but limp, unresponsive, a chilling testament to the life that had, by all medical accounts, fled her tiny body. My role was to offer comfort, to pray, to be a spiritual rock for them in the churning storm of their sorrow. I held Elena's hand when the doctors delivered another update that chipped away at their already dwindling hope. I listened to Javier's choked, barely audible questions, questions for which I, a priest of many years, had no adequate answers. I recited the comforting words of Scripture, offered the sacraments, and simply sat in the suffocating quiet, bearing witness to their unbearable pain. I was meant to embody the steadfastness of faith, the unwavering presence of God's love. Yet, with each passing day, with each flat line on the monitor, with each pronouncement of irreversible damage, I felt the foundations of my own conviction tremble. My theological training, my years of pastoral experience, my deep-seated understanding of God's benevolent plan, all of it felt woefully insufficient against the brutal reality of Lily's prognosis. I searched for the divine meaning in this senseless suffering, but found only a vast, echoing emptiness. I tried to project an image of serene certainty, but inside I felt more and more like a hollow reed in a storm, buffeted by winds of doubt and despair. The weight of their grief, compounded by my own helplessness, was a burden that threatened to crush me, threatening to dry up the very wellspring of my faith. Each morning, as I offered Mass, I would look out at the familiar faces of my parishioners, many of whom were silently, fervently praying for Lily. I would lead them in prayers for healing, for strength, for a miracle. But privately, in the hushed solitude of my chapel, my prayers became less about asking for a specific outcome, and more about simply maintaining my own spiritual equilibrium. How could I speak of God's love and mercy when confronted with such raw, unmitigated suffering? How could I offer hope when the medical reality screamed only despair? The nights were the hardest. The quiet of the rectory, usually a solace, became a stark reminder of Lily's silent room in the hospital, of Elena's tear-stained face, of Javier's numb despair. I would stare at the crucifix on my wall, its ancient form a symbol of suffering and redemption, and wonder where the redemption was in this, where the divine purpose lay in the agony of a child, where the boundless love of God found expression in the cold, clinical pronouncements of an irreversible fate. The questions clawed at the edges of my soul, persistent and unsettling. My role as a shepherd, usually a source of strength, now felt like a heavy cloak, weighing me down into an abyss of helplessness. I was witnessing the slow, agonizing death of hope, and with it, the insidious erosion of faith in the hearts of good people. And perhaps, I feared, in my own. The quiet of the rectory, usually a solace, became a stark reminder of Lily's silent room in the hospital, of Elena's tear-stained face, of Javier's numb despair. I would stare at the crucifix on my wall, its ancient form a symbol of suffering and redemption, and wonder where the redemption was in this, where the divine purpose lay in the agony of a child, where the boundless love of God found expression in the cold, clinical pronouncements of an irreversible fate. The questions clawed at the edges of my soul, persistent and unsettling. My role as a shepherd, usually a source of strength, now felt like a heavy cloak, weighing me down into an abyss of helplessness. I was witnessing the slow, agonizing death of hope, and with it, the insidious erosion of faith in the hearts of good people. And perhaps, I feared, in my own. It was Javier Garcia's absence from the hospital chapel that first pricked my already raw sensibility. Elena, though a shadow of her former vibrant self, clung to the rituals, her rosary beads worn smooth from endless repetitions, her lips moving in silent litany even when her eyes were vacant with grief. She was a testament to the enduring, almost obstinate power of faith in the face of despair. But Javier, whom I had known as a man of quiet, sturdy piety, had slowly retreated. His chair in the chapel, once faithfully occupied beside his wife, now remained stubbornly empty. First, he'd miss an evening rosary, then a morning prayer service. Soon his presence in the chapel became a rarity, replaced by long solitary hours spent pacing the hospital corridors, or simply disappearing into the anonymous, sterile labyrinth of the building. Each missed prayer, each empty seat, felt like a tiny, insistent crack appearing in the foundation of our collective faith. I saw it in the concerned glances of the parishioners who still came, their own prayers tinged with the unspoken question, if even Javier, a man so devoted, could not find solace in God's house, what hope was there for them? The silence of his absence was louder than any lament. It spoke of a spiritual erosion, a quiet surrender not to God's will, but to the crushing weight of a world devoid of divine intervention. It was a despair so profound it manifested not in anger, but in a weary, hollow retreat. My heart ached for him, not just as his priest, but as a man who understood the fragile boundaries of human endurance. I knew I had to find him, to reach out, even if I was unsure what words a priest could offer, when God himself seemed silent. It was late one Tuesday evening, after I'd left Elena's bedside, having offered what comfort I could in the face of another grim medical update. The hospital, usually a hive of hushed activity, had settled into its nighttime rhythm of soft beeps and distant whispers. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of disinfectant and the faint, sweet scent of fading cut flowers. My footsteps echoed in the deserted halls as I walked, my clerical collar feeling more like a yoke around my neck than a symbol of spiritual authority. My gaze drifted towards the main exit, and through the revolving doors, I caught a glimpse of a solitary figure in the harsh glow of the parking garage lights. It was Javier. The parking garage was a brutal landscape of concrete and shadow, a utilitarian space designed for transit, not contemplation. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint, acrid smell of exhaust fumes and stale rain. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed with a monotonous, sickly yellow glow, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with every passing car. It was a place utterly devoid of warmth, a fitting stage for the chilling drama of a soul in anguish. In the chapel one might find sanctuary. Here there was only the cold, unyielding reality of the material world, a stark contrast to the ethereal hopes we clung to inside. He was leaning against the passenger side of his well-maintained, if slightly dusty, pickup truck, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He hadn't moved for what must have been several minutes, a statue carved from exhaustion and despair. His work clothes, usually crisp and clean, were wrinkled, and a fine layer of dust clung to the denim of his jeans. His strong, calloused hands that had built and repaired for his family, now hung limp at his sides. As I approached, my soft footsteps muffled by the concrete, I saw the lines of worry etched deeper into his brow, the dark circles under his eyes like bruised plums. He looked utterly spent, like a man who had been battling a relentless current for weeks and was now on the verge of being swept away. The fight had drained him, leaving behind only an emptiness that was almost palpable. He didn't notice me until I was just a few feet away, my shadow falling over his own. He straightened slowly, his movements stiff, and his gaze when it met mine was hollow and devoid of its usual warmth. There was no surprise, no anger, just a weary resignation, as if he had been expecting me, or perhaps expecting some final crushing blow. The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I wanted to offer a word of comfort, a gentle greeting, but my throat felt tight. What comfort could I truly offer that hadn't already been said, and seemingly unheard? My heart ached, not just for Lily, but for the man standing before me, whose spirit was being slowly, painfully extinguished. Then, from the depths of his exhaustion, Javier spoke, his voice raspy, a low growl that cut through the sterile quiet of the garage. It wasn't a question, not truly, but a declaration, a verdict handed down from the tribunal of his shattered heart. "Where is he, Father?" he asked, his eyes usually so kind, now burning with a raw, impotent rage. I have prayed. My wife has not left her knees. The whole parish is praying. The whole damn parish. And for what? So we can watch the machines breathe for our little girl? So we can stand by and watch her slip away, day by excruciating day, while we beg for a miracle that never comes? His words, spoken without inflection, yet carrying the weight of a scream, slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't asking for an explanation, nor was he seeking absolution. His voice was laced with a bitterness that tasted of ash and unfulfilled promises. Each word was a stone hurled against the seemingly impenetrable walls of heaven. We were taught, he continued, his voice rising now, echoing slightly in the vastness of the garage, that he listens, that he cares, that if we ask with faith, it will be given. Is this what faith looks like, Father? This slow, public torture, this quiet dying of a child, while all our prayers, all our hope, bounce off the ceiling of a deaf, indifferent sky? His gaze was fixed on me, but it seemed to pass through me, piercing the very concept of God I held so dear. It was the howl of a lamb who feels abandoned by its shepherd, and by the master of all shepherds. In that moment, standing under the buzzing, indifferent lights, I felt a tremor run through me. Javier wasn't asking a question. He was passing a sentence. It was a condemnation, not just of God's perceived inaction, but of the very framework of faith that had guided his life, and indeed my own. In his eyes I saw not doubt, but despair. Doubt, I understood. It was a shadow that sometimes lengthened even for the most devout, a necessary intellectual wrestling that could paradoxically deepen faith. But despair? That was a spiritual poison, corrosive and absolute. It was the conviction that hope was a lie, that God was either absent, uncaring, or non-existent. It was the ultimate capitulation, a surrender not to divine will, but to utter meaninglessness. And as I met his gaze, I felt its insidious tendrils reaching for the edges of my own soul. My mind raced, searching for words, for a theological truth, for anything that might offer a balm to his bleeding spirit. I thought of Job, of suffering saints, of the mystery of divine providence. I considered quoting scripture, offering a prayer, or simply reminding him of the infinite, albeit mysterious, love of God. But the words withered on my tongue. How could I speak of mysterious ways when a man's very world had been shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces? How could I offer platitudes about God's plan when his little girl lay tethered to machines, her life ebbing away with each passing second? To offer such easy answers would not only be inadequate, it would be an insult to the sacred, monumental grief that consumed him. It would trivialize his pain, making me an accomplice to the perceived indifference he railed against. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening, filled with the echoes of his anguish. The spiritual poison he spoke of, the despair, felt like a cold contagion, seeping into my own being. My carefully constructed priestly composure, the rock-like facade I presented to my flock, began to crack under the immense pressure of his unanswerable questions. My own faith, usually a deep, calm wellspring, felt shallow and threatened. I was Father Michael, called to lead, to comfort, to guide, but in that stark moment, I felt nothing but a profound, chilling helplessness. His despair was a mirror, reflecting my own deepest, unspoken fears, the ones I pushed down with prayer and duty. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, I understood the terrifying appeal of giving up, of simply letting go of the struggle to believe. So, I did nothing. I said nothing. I simply stood there, my own shoulders slumping slightly, my gaze fixed on his tormented face. There was nothing to say, no sermon to preach, no easy grace to offer. There was only the shared space of suffering, the unspoken acknowledgement of a profound, universal human helplessness in the face of death. I stood with him in that cold, desolate garage, sharing the crushing weight of his despair, letting my own heart be broken alongside his. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed, casting long, stark shadows. The smell of exhaust mingled with the damp concrete, creating an atmosphere of urban desolation. We were two men, isolated in a vast, indifferent world, one reeling from the blows of fate, the other silently bearing witness, feeling the insidious cold of doubt and despair begin to seep into his own marrow. It was an offering of presence, the only true thing I had left to give. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, Javier pushed himself off the truck, a sigh escaping his lips, a sound of utter defeat. He didn't look at me again. He simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head, as if acknowledging a shared bitter truth. Then he walked away, his footsteps dragging, growing fainter as he disappeared into the labyrinthine shadows of the garage. He didn't get into his truck. He simply walked, perhaps towards the quiet despair of his home, or perhaps simply walking aimlessly, searching for an escape from a reality too brutal to bear. He left me standing there, alone, with the ghostly echo of his raw questions hanging in the stale air. The heavy burden of that encounter stayed with me, clinging to my soul like the damp chill of the garage. I walked back to the rectory, the night air cool and unforgiving, the stars overhead seeming indifferent to the anguish of man. Javier's face, etched with exhausted rage and bottomless despair, flashed behind my eyelids. His words, "Where is he, Father?" resonated in the chambers of my heart, stirring a deeper, more unsettling chord within my own faith. I, too, had asked such questions in the quiet of my soul, though never with such naked, furious honesty. My own spiritual resilience, usually steadfast, felt like a tattered flag fluttering in a gale. That night, sleep was a distant dream. I lay in my simple bed, the silence of my room no longer comforting but amplifying the gnawing questions Javier had articulated so powerfully. The crucifix on my wall, which had always offered solace, now seemed to hang as a stark, unanswered question mark. The suffering it depicted felt not like a prelude to resurrection, but an endless, agonizing tableau. The abyss of helplessness I had felt previously, as a shepherd watching his flock's faith erode, had deepened significantly. Now I found myself teetering on its edge, the chasm of despair yawning beneath me. If God truly was silent, if he was indifferent, then what was the point of any of it? The foundation of my priesthood, of my very life, felt precarious. The need for a sign, for an intervention, had become not just a pastoral desire for the Garcias, but a desperate personal plea for my own soul. The hospital room, despite its pastel walls and the attempt at cheerful artwork, felt like a tomb. The air conditioning hummed with a sterile indifference, a sound that, over the past fortnight, had become the soundtrack to a slowly unfolding tragedy. I sat beside Elena and Javier, their hands clasped between them, two islands of grief in a sea of medical equipment. Dr. Ramirez, a woman whose eyes held a perpetual weight of professional sympathy, spoke in a voice both gentle and firm, the kind of voice that delivers shattering news with practiced compassion. "Mr. and Mrs. Garcia," she began, her gaze moving between them, then briefly to me. "We've done everything we can. Every test, every intervention. Lily's condition, it's irreversible. The damage is too extensive." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, each one a stone dropped into the quiet pool of our hopes. "Her brain activity has ceased. What you're seeing now, it's the machines sustaining her body. There's no viable path to recovery, no quality of life we could ever hope to restore." Javier squeezed Elena's hand, his knuckles white. His face, usually so expressive, was a mask of utter exhaustion, tinged now with a terrible, silent surrender. Elena, her eyes swollen from days of weeping, simply stared at a point just beyond the doctor's shoulder, as if trying to locate a future that was rapidly dissolving. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a physical manifestation of the chasm that had opened in my soul just days earlier. Only now it seemed to expand, threatening to swallow me whole. The silence that followed Dr. Ramirez's pronouncement was not empty. It was filled with the crushing weight of unspoken goodbyes, of dreams irrevocably shattered. "We need to discuss the next steps," Dr. Ramirez continued, her voice softer now, almost a whisper, allowing her to rest, letting go. The words hung in the air, heavy with a finality that made my breath catch. Letting go. It was the clinical term for withdrawing life support, for accepting the inevitable. For me, it was a terrifying echo of Javier's earlier question, "Where is he, Father?" If this was the answer, then my own faith, already battered, felt perilously close to collapse. How could I offer comfort, offer hope, when the very ground beneath my feet felt like crumbling earth? I wanted to shout, to rail against the injustice, against the silence of a God I had served my entire life. But my voice was trapped, choked by the despair that now felt not just palpable, but absolute. Elena finally stirred, her voice a raspy whisper. "No," she said, her eyes finally meeting Dr. Ramirez's, then mine. "Not yet. We need one more night, one more prayer." "Doctor." Ramirez nodded slowly, her understanding clear. She knew the desperate hope that clung to the edges of grief, the need for ritual, for a final plea. "Of course, Elena," she said gently. "Take your time. We'll be here." As she left, the sterile hum of the machines seemed to amplify, a constant, mocking reminder of the fragile line between life and its cessation. I looked at the Garcias, their faces etched with an anguish I knew no words could truly touch. My role as their priest suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I was a shepherd, yes, but my flock was dying, and I felt utterly powerless to save them. The abyss I had felt teetering on just a night before had now opened fully, and I could feel myself sliding towards it. That evening I returned to the rectory, the doctor's words echoing in my mind like a death knell. My own crisis of faith, which had been a private battle, now demanded a public act. It was less a decision than an instinct, a primal response to absolute helplessness. I called the parish office, my voice steadier than I felt, and asked Mrs. Rodriguez, our diligent secretary, to put out an urgent notice for a parish-wide prayer vigil at St. Jude's. For Lily Garcia, I instructed, a rosary for her intercession. Tonight. There was a moment of silence on the other end, a shared understanding of the gravity that such a request carried. A parish-wide rosary vigil was not a routine event. It was a desperate plea, a gathering in the face of insurmountable odds. It was the Hail Mary pass of faith. For many, it would be an act of solidarity, a final pouring out of collective hope. For me, it was a test, a challenge thrown at the heavens. If God was truly listening, if He truly cared, then this was our last chance to prove it. As dusk settled over the town, painting the western sky in hues of bruised violet and fading orange, I walked the familiar path from the rectory to St. Jude's. The church stood, ancient and steadfast, its stained glass windows now dark, awaiting the light from within. Even from a distance I could see the cars lining the streets, spilling out of the small parking lot. A knot of apprehension, mixed with a strange, unsettling flicker of hope, tightened in my stomach. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, I was met with a sight that both humbled and overwhelmed me. The church was not just full, it was overflowing. Every pew was occupied. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, leaning against the pillars, their faces illuminated by the soft, flickering glow of hundreds of votive candles. It was a sea of worried faces, young and old, familiar and new, all drawn together by a shared concern, a communal sorrow for a little girl none of them truly knew, but for whom they felt an innate human compassion, deepened by their faith. The air inside was thick with the scent of melted wax, old wood, and the hushed murmurs of prayer. It was a sacred space, imbued with the collective hopes and fears of a community, and yet for all its spiritual weight, it felt heavy with impending loss. The silence, when it finally settled, was not empty but pregnant with unspoken pleas. I moved to the altar, my cassock rustling softly, the sounds amplified in the sudden quiet. Looking out at them, at their expectant faces, I felt a familiar surge of pastoral duty, but beneath it, the raw nerve of my own spiritual vulnerability throbbed. Elena and Javier sat in the front pew, Lily's grandparents beside them offering quiet comfort. Elena's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but there was a fierce, almost defiant stillness about her. Javier looked utterly spent, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the altar, but I could sense his presence, a silent anchor for his wife. I took my place at the ambo, the large, ornate lectern from which the scriptures were read. I held the rosary beads smooth and cool against my fingertips, a tangible link to centuries of prayer. "My dear brothers and sisters in Christ," I began, my voice surprisingly steady. "Thank you for gathering here tonight. We are here to pray for Lily Garcia, for a miracle if it be God's will, and for strength and comfort for her family." I knew, even as I spoke the words, that a part of me doubted their efficacy. If it be God's will, hadn't we been praying for His will for weeks? And hadn't His will, according to the doctors, been declared? But I pushed those thoughts aside. My flock needed me to be a conduit, not a questioner. They needed the comfort of shared prayer, the ritual, the hope, however slender. "Tonight we will pray the rosary," I announced, meditating on the sorrowful mysteries. We ask the Blessed Mother, our ultimate intercessor, to carry our prayers to her Son, to implore His mercy for little Lily. As I began the familiar opening prayers, the sign of the cross, the Apostles' Creed, the Our Father, the voices of the congregation joined mine, a wave of sound rising and falling, filling the vast space of the church. It was a beautiful, unified sound, a testament to their unwavering faith. I tried to immerse myself in it, to let the rhythmic cadence of the prayers wash over my own doubts. Then we began the sorrowful mysteries, each one a poignant reflection on Christ's passion, and each one, that night, seemed to mirror the agony of the Garcia family, and indeed, my own wrestling with God. The first sorrowful mystery, the agony in the garden. I began the Our Father, and the voices joined me for the Hail Marys. As we recited the decades, I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Christ prostrate in Gethsemane, sweating blood, begging His Father, "Let this cup pass from me." His dread, His plea, felt so intimately tied to the Garcia's dread of losing Lily, and my own fervent, desperate plea for something, anything, to avert this tragedy. Was this what it felt like to be abandoned, to face an unbearable truth alone? The collective prayer, though strong, felt almost like a lament, a shared agony. The second sorrowful mystery, the scourging at the pillar. I led the prayers, my gaze fixed on the large crucifix above the altar. Christ's body, torn and bleeding, was a stark reminder of physical suffering, but also of the unseen wounds, the wounds of the soul. Lily's tiny body, lying unresponsive in the hospital bed, was suffering a different kind of scourging, a relentless assault on her very essence. And the Garcias, stripped bare of hope, were enduring a spiritual lashing, their faith tested to its breaking point. I thought of Javier's raw anger, his feeling of being forsaken. Was this not a scourging of faith? The third sorrowful mystery, the crowning with thorns. The image of Christ's humiliation, a crown of thorns pressed onto his sacred head, brought a fresh wave of anguish. What humiliation was this? For a family to pray so fervently, for an entire community to beg, only to be met with silence. Was this the crown of thorns we wore? The agony of unanswered prayer, the piercing knowledge that our deepest desires might be thwarted by a divine will we could not comprehend. My own spirit felt weighted down, a thorny crown of powerlessness pressing into my mind. I looked at Elena, her lips moving, her eyes fixed, unblinking, on the statue of the Blessed Mother by the altar, her gaze an almost physical tether of unwavering faith. The fourth sorrowful mystery, the carrying of the cross, the path to Calvary, the heavy burden, the falls. This mystery, more than any other, resonated with the crushing weight of the past weeks. The Garcias had been carrying their cross, a burden heavier than any physical object, for 14 agonizing days. Their journey from the accident to this vigil had been a long, painful procession towards an inevitable, heart-wrenching end. And I, as their priest, had walked with them, feeling the splintered wood of that cross digging into my own shoulder, the weight of their despair becoming mine. I could almost hear the jeers of the crowd, the spiritual jeers of doubt and hopelessness, rising in my own mind. The fifth sorrowful mystery, the crucifixion and death of our Lord on the cross. My voice, though outwardly calm, felt strained as I announced the final mystery. This was it, the ultimate suffering, the death, the abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Christ's cry echoed in my soul, a terrifying resonance with Javier's despair, with my own silent questions. Was this the answer? Was this the final chapter for Lily, for the Garcias, and for my own wavering faith? The crucifixion was meant to lead to resurrection, but in that moment, under the flickering candlelight, with the reality of Lily's prognosis so stark, the promise of new life felt distant, almost cruel. It felt like we were lingering in the darkest hour, the moment of death, with no dawn in sight. As we recited the final Hail Marys, I watched Elena. Her face, framed by the candlelight, was a study in profound, beautiful devotion. Her lips moved silently, forming each word with an intensity that seemed to draw strength from some deep, unseen wellspring. Her eyes, fixed on the statue of Mary, were not just looking but pleading, communing. It was a beautiful, desperate act of faith, pure and unyielding, a mother's last, fervent plea to the ultimate mother. The statue of Mary stood serenely in her alcove, adorned with simple flowers, her gaze gentle, timeless. I had passed her countless times, a familiar comfort. Tonight, however, under Elena's desperate plea and my own internal turmoil, she seemed to hold the weight of the world. And yet, she remained silent, an elegant, unmoving stone. As the last Amen faded into the hushed echoes of the church, a cold dread settled deep in my heart. The communal prayer had concluded, the final spiritual effort expended. The weight of that Amen was not one of confident closure, but of profound finality. It felt less like a prayer that had been heard and answered, and more like a collective farewell. The spiritual exhaustion that followed was immense, a deep weariness that seeped into my bones. We had poured out our hearts, our hopes, our last reserves of faith. And now, the silence of God seemed louder than ever before, a vast, echoing emptiness where a miracle should have been. The vigil, for all its beauty and communal devotion, felt like a concession, a solemn, shared goodbye to a little girl, and perhaps to a fragile, struggling hope. The last Amen from the parish vigil had been not merely a word, but a stone dropped into a deep well, its ripple fading into an even deeper silence, a silence that resonated with a hollow, aching finality. It was not the peace of prayer concluded, but the heavy hush of surrender, of a plea exhausted and seemingly unheard. The air in St. Jude's had thickened, not with the smoke of incense but with the palpable weight of unvoiced grief, a sorrow so dense it felt as though it could be cut with a knife. The familiar comforting scent of extinguished candles, usually a signal of peaceful reflection, mingled tonight with a sharp metallic tang, the bitter taste of collective sorrow, of unshed tears, of hope's quiet demise. A cold draught, unnoticed during the warmth of shared prayer, now snaked along the ancient stone floor, chilling my ankles and whispering of a world suddenly devoid of comfort. I had stood at the church doors, a reluctant gatekeeper to despair, my own spirit a fractured thing, yet compelled to perform the ancient ritual of farewell. I offered what I hoped was a reassuring, if weak, smile, and a murmured blessing to each departing soul. My hand, usually firm and steady, rested on shoulders that felt fragile, almost brittle beneath my touch, shoulders burdened by a grief that seemed too immense for human bearing. I saw in their weary eyes and slumped postures the reflection of my own profound weariness, my own crumbling hope, a weariness that sank into the very marrow of my bones. I yearned to offer more, to speak words that carried conviction, but the wellspring of my spiritual strength felt as dry as the desert. What comfort could I truly give when my own heart was breaking, when the very foundations of my faith felt shaken? Elena and Javier, as I had known they would, had lingered. They were the last to leave, their presence a tableau of agonizing love. Their eyes, usually bright with devotion and tenderness for their little girl, were hollow, sunken pools of exhaustion and despair. Their hands, once so often clasped in prayer, were now intertwined with a fierce, desperate grip, a silent testament to a love that was being mercilessly tested, stretched to its absolute breaking point. I could feel the tremor in Javier's fingers as he held Elena's, a man battling to hold on to something, anything, in the face of such overwhelming powerlessness. I offered them what little comfort I could muster, a hoarse promise of continued prayer, knowing even as the words left my lips that they sounded hollow, inadequate. My heart issued a silent plea for strength, not just for them, but for myself, strength I wasn't sure I possessed even a flicker of. I watched them walk away, their footsteps slow and heavy, disappearing into the vast, indifferent darkness of the night, and a fresh wave of despair washed over me. The walk back to the rectory, usually a mere handful of easy paces, felt like a pilgrimage across a barren landscape, a desolate journey through a spiritual wasteland. The cool night air, usually crisp and cleansing, did little to dispel the oppressive heat of despair that clung to my skin like a suffocating shroud, a clammy internal fever. Above, the stars, usually a comforting reminder of God's boundless cosmos, now seemed cold and remote, distant pinpricks of light in an uncaring expanse. Streetlights cast long, indifferent shadows that stretched and twisted into grotesque forms, offering no warmth, no solace, only accentuating the profound sense of isolation. The familiar crunch of gravel under my shoes, a sound I had come to associate with home and routine, tonight sounded like a lament, each tiny stone a fallen tear in the profound, aching stillness. The rectory, usually a place of quiet refuge, a sanctuary from the world's clamor, felt like a tomb tonight. Its dark windows stared out like empty eyes, mirroring the emptiness I felt within, reflecting nothing but the impenetrable night. The porch light, a solitary beacon in the encroaching gloom, seemed only to accentuate the surrounding darkness, drawing sharp, painful contrasts rather than offering comfort. I fumbled with my keys, the cold metal biting against my numb fingers, the simple act of unlocking my door an exhausting effort. The click of the lock echoed too loudly in the sudden, cavernous quiet of my own home, a sound that seemed to mock the silence I craved, but found terrifying. I closed the door behind me with a soft, definitive thud, and with that small sound, the carefully constructed facade of Father Michael, the steadfast shepherd, crumbled. The public face I had worn for weeks, the pillar of strength for my grieving flock, the calm voice of reassurance, the carefully composed posture, it all dissolved like sugar in hot tea, leaving behind nothing but the bitter residue of exhaustion. I was no longer the spiritual guide, the man called to administer comfort and hope. I was just Michael, a man, tired to the bone, stripped bare by the relentless onslaught of suffering I had witnessed, overwhelmed and heartbroken by the sheer unyielding unfairness of it all. The burden of appearing strong, of carrying the collective weight of grief, had finally become too heavy. Every fiber of my being screamed for release, for a moment to simply not be the priest. My cassock, which usually felt like a second skin, a comforting mantle of my vocation, a tangible connection to the sacred, now felt like a heavy shroud, a suffocating weight I desperately needed to shed. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I were moving underwater. I unbuttoned it slowly, one button at a time, each small metallic pop a punctuation mark in the silence. The starched fabric rustled softly, a whisper against the profound quiet, as I let it fall onto the worn armchair by the door, a silent, almost ritualistic shedding of my professional self, of the public persona that had served me so faithfully. My stole, the symbol of my priestly office, its embroidered crosses representing the very hope I was struggling to find, lay limp and lifeless beside the cassock, its once vibrant gold threads seeming to mock the emptiness I felt within. I reached up and, with a sigh, loosened my clerical collar, pulling it away from my throat as if to breathe more freely. Though the air in the room, despite its chill, felt thick, suffocating, as if all the unspoken prayers and anxieties of the evening had condensed within these four walls. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind against the window panes, seemed to magnify the profound loneliness that enveloped me, pressing in from all sides. The very silence of the rectory, usually a source of peace, was now a deafening roar, filled with the echoes of unanswered prayers and my own mounting despair. I walked through the small living room, my footsteps heavy, hollow-sounding on the old wooden floor. The familiar objects, the worn armchair where I read my breviary, the dusty bookshelf filled with theological texts and spiritual classics, the austere crucifix hanging on the wall, offered no solace tonight. They were simply inert things, silent witnesses to a spiritual crisis that felt utterly personal, utterly devastating, a crisis that rendered all my years of study and devotion meaningless. My gaze fell upon the crucifix, the sculpted body of Christ, contorted in agony, his head bowed, his face etched with unimaginable suffering. For weeks I had drawn strength from that image, a reminder of divine suffering, a pledge of ultimate victory over death, a promise of resurrection. But tonight, it simply seemed to mirror my own anguish, a silent, even accusatory reflection of God's own apparent absence. Where was the triumph? Where was the resurrection in the sterile confines of Lily's hospital room, where the cold, hard logic of machines and medical prognoses offered nothing but an endgame? The image, which once spoke of hope, now seemed to scream of abandonment, of a sacred promise left unfulfilled. The kitchen was dark, and I didn't bother to turn on the light. I wasn't hungry, couldn't have swallowed a thing. The very thought of food was repugnant. My stomach churned with a nauseous mixture of grief and frustration, a burning knot of despair that settled deep within me. I moved towards my bedroom, a small, unadorned space that was my private refuge, dominated by a simple wooden bed and a worn, threadbare rug. It was here, in this most private of spaces, where I usually found respite and solace, that the dam finally broke. I didn't kneel gracefully as one might in prayer, with measured movements and reverent posture. There was no dignity in this act. I collapsed. My knees hit the cold, hard floorboards beside my bed with a dull thud, a sound that seemed to echo the impact of despair against my soul, the shattering of my carefully maintained composure. The cold seeped through my trousers, a stark physical reminder of the spiritual chill that had permeated my entire being. My hands, which had so often held the Eucharist, blessed the sick, and offered absolution, now simply clenched into useless fists at my sides, devoid of purpose, impotent in the face of this profound helplessness. My head bowed, resting heavily against the edge of the mattress. The rough fabric of the bedspread a stark, unyielding contrast to the softness I craved, to the gentle comfort my soul yearned for. It was not a formal prayer that rose from my depths. There were no memorized words, no comforting rhythm of rosary beads to trace, no eloquent invocations of saints or theological arguments. My mind was a barren landscape, stripped of eloquence, barren of theological certainties, stripped of everything but the raw, aching core of my humanity. What came out was a raw, ragged cry, a guttural sound that was more moan than speech, a desperate, unrefined lament that scraped against the walls of the silent room, a sound ripped from the deepest, most vulnerable part of my soul. "Lord!" I choked out, my voice raspy, barely a whisper against the vast silence. It was a word pulled from the deepest well of my being, a name invoked not in reverence, not in confident supplication, but in pure, unadulterated desperation, a plea torn from a heart on the verge of breaking. "Lord!" I repeated, a little louder, the sound catching in my throat, thick with unshed tears and profound anguish. I don't know what to ask." The confession hung in the air, heavy with its own truth, a humiliating admission for a priest, a shepherd of souls. I, who was supposed to know the words, to bridge the gap between humanity and the divine, found myself utterly devoid of them. My intellect, my years of study, my understanding of Scripture, all of it felt utterly useless, meaningless, in the face of this profound personal suffering, this brutal reality that defied all theological explanations. What could I ask for that hadn't already been asked, pleaded for, begged for, by the Garcia family, by the entire parish, by countless hearts across the globe? We had prayed for healing, for a miracle, for a sign of life. We had prayed for the impossible. And what had we received? Silence. Profound, agonizing silence. It was a silence that wasn't merely the absence of sound, but an active, crushing presence, a deafening indictment of our faith, of God's seeming indifference. "But she is just a child," I whispered, the words trembling with a fierce, almost savage protectiveness, a rage against the injustice of it all. The image of Lily, her small, innocent face, so vibrant and full of life just weeks ago, now still and pale, a ghostly shadow of herself, flashed behind my eyelids. Her infectious laughter, her simple, profound questions about God and angels, the feel of her small, trusting hand in her mother's. These cherished memories were like sharp shards in my heart, each one a fresh stab of pain. She hadn't lived enough to sin, hadn't experienced enough joy or sorrow to deserve this cruel fate. Why her? Why this pure, unblemished life, hanging by a thread that was about to be severed by human hands, with divine consent? Have mercy, I pleaded, the ancient prayer taking on a new, desperate urgency, stripped of its liturgical formality. It wasn't an abstract theological concept now. It was a visceral, aching need for the hand of God to reach down, to intervene, to contradict the cold, unyielding laws of biology and medicine that had pronounced her fate. Mercy not as a reward for our faith, which felt so thin and fragile, but as a pure, unmerited act of divine compassion for a suffering world, for suffering parents, for a suffering child whose only crime was existing. My mind raced, circling the abyss of despair, teetering on the edge of a precipice. I had counseled countless others through loss, held hands at deathbeds, spoken of God's mysterious plan, of heaven, of reunion. But tonight, all those well-worn paths of comfort, all those carefully constructed narratives of divine purpose, felt like hollow platitudes, utterly empty and meaningless in the face of Lily's impending death. Javier's raw rage, his guttural question, "Where is he, Father?" echoed in my ears, bouncing off the silent walls of my room, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I had no answer, not even for myself. My own faith, usually a sturdy oak, deeply rooted and resilient, felt like a sapling caught in a hurricane, bending precariously under the crushing weight of this impending tragedy, threatening to snap. The very foundation of my calling, of my life's purpose, felt threatened, undermined. If God was truly good, if God was truly all-powerful, how could he allow this? And if he wasn't, if he was either cruel or impotent, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of prayer, of hope, of faith, of a lifetime dedicated to his service? The questions were dangerous, corrosive, spiritual acid burning through my soul, and I pushed them away with all the dwindling strength I possessed, clinging to the last shred of my belief, a fragile thread in a tempest. "Send us a sign," I managed, the plea barely audible, choked with unshed tears that finally began to fall, hot and stinging, tracing paths down my cold cheeks. "Send us something." The word something hung there, imprecise, undefined, yet burdened with the entire weight of my crumbling hope, of my desperate yearning for divine acknowledgement. It was an almost childish plea, stripped of all sophistication, a primal cry into the void. I wasn't presuming to dictate God's will. I was simply begging, desperately, for a glimmer, a whisper, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness that threatened to engulf us all. Anything to affirm his presence, his care, his power. Anything to save Lily, yes, to pull her back from the precipice, but also anything to save Elena and Javier from the desolation that was surely about to consume them, a grief that would poison their very souls. And perhaps, if I was truly honest in that desperate moment, anything to save a sliver of my own faltering faith from being swallowed whole by the encroaching abyss of despair. My prayer was not eloquent, not polished, not theologically sound in its raw, unfiltered demand. It was the prayer of a man at the absolute end of his rope, his heart laid bare, his soul crying out in an agony that transcended words, transcended all reason. It was a final, desperate appeal flung into the vast, indifferent expanse of the night, a last, fragile tether stretched across the terrifying chasm of despair. I felt utterly drained, physically and spiritually emptied, as if every ounce of hope, every drop of faith had been wrung from me. I remained there, crumpled on the cold floor, listening to the frantic, irregular thudding of my own heart in the suffocating quiet, waiting, simply waiting, for an answer, for something, in the profound and terrifying silence that followed my plea. The night stretched on, vast and empty, and I felt as though I were teetering on the very edge of everything I believed in, peering into a darkness that seemed to hold no promise of dawn, only an endless, cold oblivion. The silence that followed my desperate plea was not merely the absence of sound. It was a vast, heavy blanket, pressing down with an almost physical weight. I remained, crumpled and defeated, on the cold rectory floor, the air thick with the residue of my own raw anguish. My heart, a panicked bird trapped in a cage, thudded erratically against my ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the profound stillness of the hour. The night stretched on, an endless, unyielding expanse, and I felt adrift, a solitary vessel listing precariously on the terrifying chasm of despair, teetering on the very precipice of all I had ever believed. I must have drifted, not into true sleep, but into that fragile liminal space between waking and oblivion, where thoughts are untethered and reality blurs at the edges. It was not a sound that roused me, nor a sudden jolt. It was rather an unfolding, a gentle but insistent presence, a warmth, subtle yet pervasive, began to gather in the corner of my simple room, near the old wooden dresser. It was not the intrusive glare of artificial light, nor the pale, indifferent wash of the moon through the window. This was a soft, silvery luminescence, emanating from no discernible source, yet filling that space with an ethereal glow that spoke of something ancient and pure. It shimmered, almost like heat haze, but cool and inviting, and within its gentle embrace, I began to discern form. From the heart of this luminous mist, she emerged. It was not an abrupt materialization, but a slow, graceful coalescing, as if the very air were gathering itself into a divine sculpture. And then, she was simply there. The Blessed Virgin Mary stood beside my bed, not towering or imposing, but radiant with a serene humility that belied the immense power of her presence. Her form was cloaked in simple white, luminous yet modest, and around her head, though there was no visible halo, there radiated a softness, an inner light that seemed to bless the very dust motes dancing in the air. Her face, oh, her face. It was a portrait of profound maternal compassion. There was sorrow in her eyes, yes, a deep understanding of human suffering, an empathy that reached into the very core of my own desolation. But interwoven with that sorrow was an infinite tenderness, a boundless love that felt like a balm to my lacerated soul. She did not speak a word, and yet her presence was a symphony, a profound communication that transcended the limitations of language. Every line of her gentle countenance, every curve of her graceful posture, spoke volumes. There was no grand annunciation, no triumphant blast of trumpets, no chorus of celestial voices echoing through my humble rectory. There was only a profound peace, so absolute, so pervasive, that it saturated the very air, silencing not only the world outside but also the frantic clamor within my own heart. It was a stillness so complete that it felt like the breath of God Himself, gently resting upon the chaos of human existence. And then I noticed the scent. It was subtle at first, a faint, sweet whisper, then growing in strength until it permeated every corner of the room. The unmistakable, intoxicating fragrance of fresh-cut roses. Not the heavy, cloying perfume of an old lady's vanity, but the vibrant, living scent of blossoms newly opened to the morning sun, dewy and pure, filling the rectory with an unexpected, impossible beauty. It was a scent that spoke of grace, of purity, of a garden untouched by the blight of the world, a direct sensory link to the divine. This aroma, more than any vision, anchored the experience in a tangible reality, a proof my human senses could grasp. It was the signature of a heavenly visit, a gentle caress on the edges of my bewildered perception. She simply looked at me, her gaze holding me captive, pinning me not with judgment, but with an unconditional love that was a direct conduit for the boundless power of God. In that moment, through the silent language of her eyes, I understood that my anguish, Javier's despair, Elena's fervent prayers, none of it had been ignored. Her presence was the answer, not in words, but in the overwhelming, irrefutable truth of divine solicitude. She was here, in my rectory, in my humble bedroom, because a child was dying, and because her children, through their broken, desperate prayers, had moved the heart of heaven itself. Then, as gently as a leaf turning in a soft breeze, she shifted, her head tilted slightly, her eyes, filled with that same compassionate light, turned toward the window. My gaze instinctively followed hers, out into the impenetrable darkness of the night, beyond the rectory grounds, beyond the quiet suburban streets, to where the hospital glowed, a beacon of human suffering, against the distant horizon. There was no mistaking the direction, no ambiguity in her silent instruction. It was a clear, unambiguous gesture, a silent command that resonated with more authority and urgency than any shouted word. Go. And then, as serenely and gracefully as she had appeared, the silvery light began to recede, drawing her form back into its luminous embrace. The outlines softened, blurred, and then, without a ripple or a trace, the light faded, and she was gone. The overwhelming peace lingered, a comforting afterglow in the now darkened room, and so too did the intoxicating scent of roses, potent and undeniable, a physical testament to a spiritual visitation. I was left alone, kneeling by my bed, but I was not the same man who had crumpled there hours before. The despair that had clung to me like a shroud was utterly dissolved, replaced by a seismic shift within my soul. There was no question, no doubt, no lingering trace of the skepticism that often shadows even the most faithful heart. What remained was an unshakable certainty, a profound, undeniable knowing that transcended logic and reason. Our Lady had been here. She had seen my brokenness, heard my desperate plea, and in the deepest stillness of the night, she had delivered a message. It was a message of mercy, of intercession, of a love so vast it could bend the very laws of the universe. My heart, once a frantic bird, now beat with a steady, resolute rhythm, imbued with a wild, sacred hope. I did not pause to question it, to analyze the impossibility. There was simply no time. The scent of roses still heavy in the air, I knew, with every fiber of my being, what I had to do. Lily. The scent of roses, so impossibly vivid and fresh, still clung to the air in my small rectory room as I stumbled out, not bothering to change from my sleep-worn pajamas. The cold night air was a shock against my skin, but it was a fleeting sensation, overwhelmed by the fervent heat rising within me. My heart was not merely pounding, it was singing, a chaotic symphony of fear and an exhilarating, almost terrifying hope. I fumbled for my car keys, my hand still faintly trembling, not from doubt, but from the residual energy of the sacred encounter, like an aftershock of grace. The drive to the hospital, ordinarily a 10-minute journey through familiar suburban streets, felt both instantaneous and stretched across an eternity. Each street lamp that passed cast fleeting shadows into the car, but they could not touch the brilliant silvery light that seemed etched behind my eyelids, nor could the rumble of the engine drown out the silent echo of that maternal gaze. I navigated by instinct, my thoughts a kaleidoscope of Lily's pale, still face, Elena's tear-ravaged eyes, Javier's quiet despair, and then, superimposed over it all, the profound, compassionate face of Our Lady, her eyes directing me, as clearly as any spoken word, to this very destination. I prayed, but not with formal words. It was a torrent of raw gratitude, a desperate, silent plea that the vision I had just witnessed was not a figment of my sleep-deprived imagination, but the very hand of God reaching into our broken world. The hospital doors, usually a barrier to the outside world, parted for me with an almost eerie ease, as if guided by an unseen force. The antiseptic smell, once a symbol of the sterile finality that had clung to Lily's room, now felt like an unholy affront to the blossoming hope in my chest. I burst into the ICU waiting room, my unkempt appearance utterly forgotten, and saw them. Elena and Javier sat huddled together on the uncomfortable plastic chairs, their faces streaked with tears, their shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it seemed to pull the very air from the room. Their eyes, when they lifted to meet mine, held a hollow, resigned despair. They had just given their consent. The doctors had delivered the final crushing news, and they had agreed to let their little girl go. My arrival, it seemed, was too late. A knot tightened in my stomach, a cold dread threatening to extinguish the flame of hope that had consumed me. Had I misunderstood? Had my fervent prayer been only a dream? Before I could speak, before I could even fully comprehend the depth of their renewed suffering, the doors to Lily's room swung open with a sudden violence. A nurse, a woman I recognized as perpetually calm and efficient, stood there, her face a mask of utter shock. Her usually neatly tied hair was disheveled, and her eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned the waiting room before locking onto the doctor who was just emerging, ready to address the Garcias. "Doctor!" she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper that nonetheless cut through the heavy silence. You need to come back. Now." Her hand trembled as she pointed back into the room. The doctor, a man whose professional demeanor had seemed unshakable for weeks, frowned, a hint of annoyance in his tired eyes. "Nurse Thompson, we've already discussed—" "No!" she interrupted, her voice rising, edged with a raw, almost hysterical astonishment. "Just come, please. She's stirring." Those two words, "she's stirring," hung in the air like a sudden, impossible chime. Elena's head snapped up. Javier froze. My own breath caught in my throat. A tidal wave of conflicting emotions, disbelief, terror, and that wild, sacred hope, crashing over me. The doctor, sensing the profound shift in the nurse's composure, cast a confused glance at us, then hurried back into the room. We followed, a silent, desperate procession, our hearts thundering in unison. The ICU room, once a chamber of silent vigil, now hummed with an almost palpable energy. The soft glow of monitors, the steady rhythmic beep-beep-beep of the life support machines, all were unchanged, yet everything felt different. Our eyes flew to the bed, to the small, fragile form of Lily. And then, we saw it. A faint twitch in her fingers, a subtle shift of her head on the pillow. And then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, her eyelids fluttered, once, twice, a hesitant, fragile movement that defied every medical prognosis, every cold, clinical fact we had been given for 14 agonizing days. A collective gasp escaped our lips. Elena moved first, a guttural cry of pure, unfiltered maternal love escaping her. She reached the bedside as Lily's eyes, those beautiful, deep brown eyes that had been vacant and unseeing for so long, slowly, deliberately opened. They were cloudy at first, unfocused, but then they cleared, finding Elena's tear-streaked face. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor passed through Lily's small body. And then, the words. Words that were not just a sound, but a resurrection. "Mommy," Lily whispered, her voice a reedy, parched sound, but undeniably hers. "Mommy, I'm thirsty." The universe seemed to hold its breath. The doctor, who had been leaning over Lily, stethoscope dangling uselessly from his hand, straightened up slowly, his face drained of all color, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from Lily to the monitors, then to us, his eyes wide with an utterly speechless, profound shock. The machine still hummed, still showed their data, but the girl lying on the bed was no longer just a collection of medical readings. She was a living, breathing, thirsty child. In that instant, the impossible bent to the will of God. The scientific understanding of the world, with its rigid laws and predictable outcomes, crumbled before the boundless, merciful love that had permeated my room just hours before. This was not a medical anomaly. It was an act of divine intervention, a grace so potent it had reversed the seemingly irreversible. Elena collapsed onto the bed, cradling Lily, tears of joy now streaming down her face, indistinguishable from her earlier tears of sorrow. Javier, a man who had been on the precipice of losing his faith, stood rooted to the spot, his hands trembling, a silent, profound prayer of thanks forming on his lips. I watched them, my own heart overflowing with an awe so immense it brought me to my knees, right there on the sterile hospital floor. The scent of roses, subtle but unmistakable, seemed to blossom faintly in the air around us, a private, sacred confirmation. The chaos that ensued was a beautiful thing. Nurses rushing in, doctors consulting, their voices a mixture of clinical assessment and bewildered wonder. They poked, they prodded, they ran new scans. But the evidence was undeniable. Lily Garcia, whose brain scans had shown no life, was awake. She was speaking. She was thirsty. It was much later, well past dawn, after the initial wave of joyous disbelief had given way to a cautious but undeniable hope, that I returned to the rectory. My mind was a whirlwind of images. The silvery light, Our Lady's compassionate gaze, Lily's fluttering eyelids, Elena's joyful sob. I was dazed, overflowing with a gratitude that felt too vast for my single heart to contain. As I pulled into the rectory driveway, the first rays of the morning sun painting the sky in hues of soft pink and gold, I saw them. Two figures silhouetted against the nascent light waiting on my porch. Detectives Miller and Davies. They stood, awkward and grim-faced, in the quiet morning air. Miller cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over my disheveled state, the pajamas beneath my hastily donned coat. "Father Michael," he began, his voice flat, professional. "We regret to inform you the driver of the other vehicle, Mr. Thomas O'Malley, he took his own life last night." He paused and then added with a hint of professional bewilderment, "He left a note. Mentioned your name, Father. Said he was sorry for everything. Said he couldn't live with what he'd done. And he wrote something else. Something about seeing angels." The world, which had just hours ago expanded to encompass the divine, now twisted back inexplicably onto a more mundane, yet no less tragic, axis. The guilt-ridden driver, the car crash, the initial reason for my involvement in the Garcia's suffering, it all came rushing back. The narrative loop, which had opened with their suspicion of my impossible claims, now seemed to close, not with a logical explanation, but with an echo of the very supernatural event that had transpired in my room. A miracle had been made manifest, and the threads of human sorrow and divine intervention, of earthly consequence and heavenly grace, had woven together into a tapestry far too intricate for any man to fully unravel. Lily's full recovery. The doctors, bless their scientific hearts, still speak of it as an unprecedented spontaneous remission, a medical anomaly that defies classification. Her official file, I am told, carries a permanent, baffling addendum. For them, it is a mystery of the body. For us, it is a revelation of the soul. Lily herself, now back in school, a vibrant, curious 7-year-old with a smile that could outshine the morning sun, often speaks of a dream she had, a lady in white who smelled of flowers, holding her hand. Her parents, Elena and Javier, no longer pray with the desperation born of despair, but with a quiet, profound certainty. Their faith, once shattered, was not just rebuilt. It rose from the ashes, stronger and more vibrant than any of us had dared to hope. The parish of St. Jude's, our little haven of lost causes, became a testament to what God can do when all human hope is gone. The detectives, Miller and his partner, returned once more, their expressions a blend of professional courtesy and deep bewilderment. They closed their files, shaking their heads at the inexplicable circumstances surrounding Lily's recovery and the driver's final cryptic note. I imagine their reports are filled with more questions than answers, a factual account of events that defies any logical conclusion. For them, I remained the peculiar priest inhabiting a reality slightly askew from their own, a man who spoke of miracles and roses when they dealt in evidence and motive. Perhaps that is how it must be. For some truths are not meant for police reports, but for the quiet chambers of the human heart. My role in all of this, I have come to understand, was not to be the agent of the miracle, but simply its first bewildered witness. God did not choose me because I was worthy, or particularly holy, or possessed some special insight. He chose me, I believe, because I was there, and because, in my desperation, I had finally reached the absolute end of my own strength and intellect. It was the prayer of a man drowning, a raw cry for something, and it was precisely into that void that His grace poured. His miracles, I've learned, are not for the proud or the self-sufficient. They are a lifeline for those submerged in the dark, a divine whisper that pierces the loudest storm of despair and says, "I am here. Do not be afraid." Now, when I celebrate Mass or offer comfort at a bedside, my words carry a different weight. My faith is no longer solely a matter of theology, of ancient texts and reasoned arguments. It is a memory, vivid and indelible, of a soft, silvery light in the deepest stillness of the night. It is the distinct, unmistakable scent of fresh-cut roses that lingers in the corners of my rectory, a sweet, ethereal fragrance that reminds me of the Blessed Mother's quiet, compassionate gaze. It is the profound, unshakable certainty that our God is not distant, but intimately involved, reaching down into our human brokenness with love and power beyond all telling. And in that memory of roses, I find strength and hope and an enduring peace that passes all understanding.